The day Edna Keating walked into Ralph Bishop's barn, she had no intention of staying longer than 5 minutes, and he had no intention of letting anyone into his life ever again. The summer of 1873 had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with a ferocity that felt almost personal, as though the land itself had decided to punish the people living on it. The prairie grass had gone brittle and pale by the middle of June, and the creek that ran behind the Keating property had shrunk to a thin, muddy ribbon that the cattle barely bothered to drink from. Edna stood at her kitchen window every morning and watched the horizon shimmer with heat and thought about all the things her husband Thomas had promised would get better. He had been dead for 7 months, and none of those things had gotten better at all. Thomas Keating had been 34 years old when a spooked horse threw him against a fence post on the north end of their property on a cold November morning. The doctor had ridden out from town, taken one look at Thomas's head wound, and told Edna with the clinical detachment of a man who had seen too much grief to feel any of it anymore that her husband would not survive the night. He had been right. Thomas was gone before the stars came out, and Edna had sat in the chair beside his bed holding his hand even after it had gone cold, not because she expected him to wake up, but because she did not know what else to do. She was 31 years old and widowed with one daughter, a 7-year-old named Clara who had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and a cattle operation that was held together with prayer and baling wire. Edna had grown up on a farm in Missouri, so she was not helpless, not by any measure of the word. She knew how to mend fence, and she knew how to doctor a sick calf, and she knew how to stretch a pantry further than it had any right to stretch. But there were things she did not know, and the gap between what she knew and what she needed to know had grown wide enough by that July to swallow her whole. The saddle was the immediate problem. Her own saddle, the one she used every day to check the cattle and ride the fence line, had cracked clean through the tree after one of the ranch hands had left it sitting in direct sun on top of a fence rail for 3 days straight. The ranch hand in question had been let go 2 weeks earlier when Edna realized she could no longer afford to pay him, and she had discovered the ruined saddle only after he was gone, which meant there was no one to be angry at except the situation itself. She had one other saddle in the barn, a heavy old stock saddle that had belonged to Thomas's father, but it was too large for her, and the stirrups could not be adjusted enough to make it safe for a woman of her height and build. She had heard about Ralph Bishop the way everyone in Caldwell heard about their neighbors, in small pieces over long periods of time. She knew he ran a fair-sized cattle operation about 4 miles to the northeast, that he had come down from Nebraska some years back, that he was generally regarded as an honest man who kept to himself and did not cause trouble. She had seen him exactly twice, once at the feed store where he had tipped his hat to her without speaking, and once at the church social the previous Easter where he had stood near the back wall the entire time and left before the food was served. He was tall, she remembered that much, broad through the shoulders, a man who looked like the land had shaped him the same way it shaped everything else out here, by demanding more than it gave. She also knew, because this was a small town and small towns kept such records in the collective memory of their residents, that Ralph Bishop had been married once, briefly, to a woman named Catherine who had come out from Ohio and found Kansas entirely unsuitable for human habitation, and had gone back to Ohio after 11 months, taking their son with her. This was apparently not a subject anyone discussed with Ralph directly, and so the town had reached a kind of silent agreement to treat it as a thing that had happened the way storms happened, something that left damage and then was never mentioned again. Edna did not particularly care about any of that history on the morning. She hitched her 2 remaining horses to the wagon and drove Clara to her friend Millie's house, and then pointed herself northeast toward the Bishop Ranch. She cared about borrowing a saddle so she could ride her fence line and figure out why she was losing cattle. That was all. The Bishop Ranch was a more substantial operation than she had expected. The house was modest enough, a low-slung affair with a covered porch and white paint that had seen better days, but the outbuildings were solid and well-maintained, and the pastures she could see from the lane held good-looking cattle in numbers that suggested a man who knew what he was doing. There was a bunkhouse along the south fence that looked recently repaired, and a large vegetable garden behind the main house that struck her as unusual for a man living alone. She pulled the wagon up in front of the barn because the barn doors were open and she could hear movement inside. She climbed down, straightened her skirt, and walked in without knocking because you did not knock on a barn door. Ralph Bishop was in the middle of treating a horse's foreleg, crouched down in the straw with a length of clean linen in his hands and his hat pushed back on his head. He looked up when her shadow fell across the threshold, and the expression on his face cycled through surprise and something that might have been wariness before settling into a careful neutrality. "Mrs. Keating," he said, and she was mildly surprised that he knew her name without being told. "Mr. Bishop," she said. "I apologize for coming without sending word first. I have a situation, and I am hoping you might be able to help." He stood, unhurrying, finished wrapping the horse's leg with the efficiency of long practice, and patted the animal's flank before turning to face her fully. He was close to 40, she thought, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something stronger than it had started as. His eyes were a light gray-green that she had not noticed in their previous brief encounters, and they were watching her with an attentiveness that she found slightly disconcerting. "What kind of situation?" he asked. She told him about the saddle. She told him plainly, without embellishment or self-pity, the way she had learned to tell people things in the 7 months since Thomas died. She had noticed that self-pity made people uncomfortable and embellishment made them suspicious, and she had very little patience for either reaction. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, then turned and walked deeper into the barn toward a row of saddle racks along the far wall. He had 4 saddles there, and he looked at them the way a person looked at a shelf of books, deciding which one to offer. "This one," he said, lifting a medium-weight saddle that was well-worn but clearly sound, "belonged to one of my hands who moved on last spring. Should fit you better than something built for a man twice your size." "I would need it for at least 2 weeks," she said, "possibly 3 while I arrange a replacement. You can have it for as long as you need it." She had brought $2 to offer him because she did not like owing things she had not paid for. She held them out and he looked at the coins in her palm and then looked at her face and shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "I prefer to pay. And I prefer not to take money for a borrowed saddle from a neighbor who needs it. We can disagree about it, or you can take the saddle and go check on your cattle." There was no unkindness in his voice, but there was a finality that she recognized as the same kind she used herself. She put the money back in her pocket. "Thank you," she said. "You losing many?" he asked, and it took her a moment to understand that he was asking about cattle. "More than I should be," she said. "I think the fence on the northeast corner is down, or close to it. I had a section of wire that was running thin last fall, and I never got to it before the ground froze." He was quiet for a moment, loading the saddle onto his forearm to carry it to her wagon. "I had a stretch of fence go down on the eastern edge 2 weeks ago," he said. "Found 3 of my cattle over on Harmon's land. If yours is thin on that northeast corner, they might be crossing." She had not thought of that. She had been so focused on the possibility of theft or predators that the simple logic of a fence gap had been sitting right there unexamined. "I will check it today," she said. He loaded the saddle into her wagon with the ease of a man for whom lifting large things was simply part of existing in the world. Then he stood beside the wagon and looked at her with that careful attention again. "If you need help with the fence repair," he said, "I'm headed out that direction this week anyway to check my own line. I could take a look." She considered that offer for a longer moment than she spent considering most things. She was not accustomed to asking for help, and more importantly, she was not accustomed to having it offered without a complicated undercurrent of expectation or pity. Ralph Bishop sounded like a man simply stating a practical fact. "I would appreciate that," she said. He came 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, riding a good bay horse and pulling a small wagon with fence posts and wire and the tools for the work. He came early, before the heat set in, which told her he understood how to work in this climate. Edna was already out on the borrowed saddle when she saw him coming up the lane, and she lifted a hand to wave, and then turned her horse back toward the fence line without ceremony, and he followed without fanfare. And that was how they spent the first full day together. They worked side by side for 6 hours, and in that time they talked about cattle prices and rainfall patterns and the particular stubbornness of Kansas soil when it came to setting fence posts. And not once did they talk about Thomas or Catherine, and Edna found this to be a profound and unexpected relief. She had spent 7 months being Edna Keating the widow. For 6 hours on a Thursday in July, she was simply a rancher talking shop with another rancher. And by the end of the day, the fence was solid and her cattle were accounted for, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a person who was capable of solving her own problems. Ralph stayed for supper because she offered, and because refusing supper after 6 hours of shared labor would have been strange. She cooked beans and salt pork and corn bread, and Clara came home from Millie's house and regarded the tall stranger at the table with the frank assessment only 7-year-olds are capable of before deciding he was acceptable because he had, during supper, without being asked, refilled the water bucket from the pump outside when he noticed it was getting low. He did the water, Clara informed Edna later, as though this was the deciding factor in some larger judgment. I noticed, Edna said. Ralph rode back to his own place as the sun was going down, and Edna watched the dust from his horse's hooves settle back onto the road, and thought that this was a good neighbor and nothing more, and that was exactly what she needed. The problem was that August happened. August in Kansas in 1873 was brutal in ways that went beyond the merely physical. 3 of Edna's cattle died in a week from what she diagnosed, correctly, as heat exhaustion compounded by the bad water from the shrinking creek. She lost a barn cat to a rattlesnake. Clara got a fever that lasted 4 days and had Edna sitting up through 3 nights in a row with a damp cloth and a great deal of controlled fear. The fever broke cleanly, the way childhood fevers often did, and Clara was eating everything in sight 2 days later. But those 3 nights had taken something out of Edna that she was not sure she could get back easily. She did not send for Ralph during any of this. She handled it herself because she was a woman who handled things herself, and because she was not in the habit of calling on people unless she had a clear and specific need they could meet. He came anyway, on the 4th day of the fever, with a jar of his housekeeper Mrs. Doyle's willow bark tea, and the information that Mrs. Doyle swore it worked better than anything the doctor kept in his bag. He did not stay long. He left the jar on the porch table, asked after Clara, learned the fever had broken, nodded once in what appeared to be genuine relief, and left. She found herself thinking about that nod for 3 days afterward. There was something in it that she could not quite locate the edges of. It was not the nod of a polite neighbor performing appropriate concern. It was something more direct than that, less mediated, and it made her feel seen in a way that was slightly alarming. He came back the following week to collect his fence-working tools, which he had left in her wagon by accident, and she invited him for coffee because that was what you did, and they sat on the porch and drank it and watched the evening come down over the land, and this time the conversation moved differently. She is not sure which one of them turned it in the new direction. Maybe neither of them did it deliberately. Maybe the prairie evening just had a way of loosening things. Do you miss Nebraska? She asked him. Parts of it, he said, not the cold. You grew up there, born there. My father came out from Pennsylvania after the war. He wanted land and quiet. He was quiet himself for a moment. He found plenty of both. My father came from Missouri, she said. I was born there. I came out here with Thomas when we married. She had not said Thomas's name to someone outside of practical necessity in several months. It sat differently in her mouth than it used to. He was a good man, Ralph asked. The question was simple, but it was asked with care, the kind of care that suggested he understood it was a loaded question and was asking it anyway because he thought she might want to be asked. "He was a very good man," she said. "He was not always practical and he was not always right, but he was good. There is a difference." Ralph turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Yes," he said, "there is." She did not ask him about Catherine. She thought about it and then thought that he would talk about that when he was ready to, or he would not, and either way it was not something she was going to pull out of him like a splinter. As it turned out, he told her about Catherine in September, on an evening when they had fallen into what had become a comfortable pattern of occasional shared suppers and porch conversations, and the telling of it was done in the same plain way he seemed to do most things, without drama but without sparing the harder parts. "She was not wrong to leave," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This is not an easy place to live, and I was not an easy man to live with. I was working so hard to make the ranch what it needed to be that I forgot to be present in my own house most of the time. She came out here expecting a life, and I gave her a building project. He was looking at the darkening sky. I do not blame her." "And your son?" Edna asked. "William, he is 12 now." His jaw moved briefly. "She writes now and then. He is well." "That is something," Edna said. "It is," he said. "It is not enough, but it is something." By October, the pattern had become something she would have been hard-pressed to describe to anyone who asked, because she was not sure she had the right words for it. Ralph was not courting her, exactly, or if he was, it was the most undramatic courting she had ever heard of. He came by because things needed doing, and he was the kind of man who helped with things that needed doing. He fixed a hinge on her cellar door that had been troubling her for weeks. She patched his coat where the lining had torn because his housekeeper had moved back to her daughter's family in October, and he had no one to do the mending. They traded labor and goods and conversation the way neighbors did, and yet it was not quite what neighbors did, because neighbors did not sit on porches in the last light of fall evenings and talk about their fathers and their losses and the particular ache of being alone in a wide country. Clara had decided she liked him. This happened in stages. The water bucket had been the beginning. The next stage was the discovery that Ralph could whittle, and he had produced a small horse from a piece of cedar wood and given it to her one evening without any ceremony whatsoever, the way he did most things, and Clara had looked at it for a long moment and then clutched it with both hands and disappeared into the house. The final stage of Clara's approval came when Ralph fixed the wheel on Clara's small wagon that Thomas had built for her, and repaired it so well that it rolled better than it ever had, and Clara ran the wagon back and forth across the porch 3 times to verify this, and then looked at Ralph with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who has made up her mind. "He is good with things," Clara told Edna later. "He is," Edna agreed. What she did not tell Clara was that Ralph was also good at other things that were harder to name. He was good at knowing when to speak and when not to. He was good at listening in a way that suggested he was actually considering what was being said rather than waiting for his turn to talk. He was good at being present in a room without demanding anything from the room, which was a quality Edna had not fully understood she valued until she experienced it. The first night she admitted to herself that she was in trouble feeling-wise was a Tuesday in late October when the first real cold snap of the season came through, and she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of rain turning to sleet on the roof and thought immediately, before anything else, not of her cattle or her fence or her firewood supply, but of whether Ralph had enough wood stacked to get through a cold snap that came this early. She lay in the dark for a few minutes, appalled at herself, and then got up to check the firewood situation as a way of redirecting her own thoughts into something practical. The firewood was fine. She had enough for the winter. And Ralph Bishop, who had been managing a ranch in Kansas for years without her assistance, certainly had enough firewood for a cold snap. She went back to bed and lay in the dark feeling unsettled in a way that she recognized as the particular unsettlement of a woman who has accidentally developed feelings for someone she did not intend to develop feelings for. She spent November being very sensible about it. She kept the visits to a reasonable frequency. She kept the conversation practical and neighborly. She was polite and warm and did not allow herself to look at him for longer than was necessary when he was talking to her. This strategy worked tolerably well as strategies go, which is to say it did not work at all, but it gave her something to do with the uncomfortable energy of it. He showed up in the second week of November with a haunch of venison and a look on his face that she had not seen there before. It took her a moment to identify it, because she had spent months reading his face and learning its usual expressions, and this one was different. It was the look of a man who had been working himself up to something, and had arrived at the moment of either doing it or going back home, and was not entirely sure which way he would fall. She let him in and took the venison and put it on the kitchen table and said, "Coffee." "In a minute," he said. She turned around to look at him. He was standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen before. Ralph Bishop was the kind of man who wore his hat like a second skin. The hat being off and held in his hands told her a great deal about the state of things. "Edna," he said, and then stopped, and she could see him searching for the words with the same concentration he brought to all difficult tasks. "Ralph," she said, because she could see he needed a little help getting started. "I have been thinking about something for a couple of months now," he said, "and I am not a man who talks in circles, so I am going to say it plainly, and you can tell me I am mistaken, and I will accept that, and we will go back to the way things have been, which has been very good. It has been good. I want you to know that." "I know it has," she said, "but I think it could be better," he said. "I think it could be better than just good, and I think you might think so too. And I would rather say that out loud and be wrong than not say it and wonder." She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment she thought about Thomas, about the 7 months of grief and the hard work of becoming a widow, and the harder work of becoming a person who could be something other than a widow. She thought about Clara's cedar horse, and the fixed wheel on the wagon, and 3 nights of fever, and a jar of willow bark tea left on a porch. She thought about October evenings on the porch, and the particular relief of being talked to like a person rather than a tragedy. "You are not mistaken," she said. He let out a breath that seemed to have been held for quite some time. Then the corners of his mouth moved into the quiet, controlled smile she had seen him use only a handful of times, the one he kept for things that genuinely pleased him. "Good," he said. "That is good." "It is," she agreed. They had the coffee. What followed was a winter courtship that was unlike anything Edna had ever expected from herself, which is to say it was both deeply practical and deeply tender, in the same way that Ralph himself was both of those things. He came by 3 or 4 times a week, and sometimes they worked together on things that needed doing around her property, and sometimes they just talked, and sometimes he read aloud from the newspapers he got twice a week from the post in town, because Edna's eyes had been bothering her since September and she was convinced she needed spectacles but had not yet done anything about it. He was a good reader. She had not expected that. He read with expression and intelligence, pausing on things that were interesting and making observations that showed he was thinking about what he was reading, rather than simply producing the words aloud. One evening he read her an article about the cattle industry, and then they argued about it for 45 minutes in a way that was genuinely energizing, because he had opinions and she had opinions, and neither of them felt the need to defer to the other's opinion simply for the sake of peace. "I like arguing with you," she told him one evening, slightly surprised by this. He looked at her with that attentive gray-green gaze. "I like arguing with you too," he said. "Most people agree with me because they think I want them to. Most people probably do want that." "Yes," he said, "I find it dull." She understood in that moment something she had not quite articulated before, that Ralph Bishop had been as lonely as she had, in his way, for a long time. Not just since his marriage ended, but perhaps before it. She did not say this because it was the kind of observation that a person had to come to themselves, but she felt the weight of it, and it made something in her chest ache in a way that was more tenderness than sadness. He kissed her for the first time on a December evening, after a particularly good supper of roasted chicken that she had made with herbs from her dried garden stores. They had been standing in the kitchen, and she had been reaching past him to get something from the shelf, and they had both gone still at the same moment, and the stillness had a quality to it that was very different from the comfortable stillness of their evenings on the porch. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her with an expression that was, for once, not carefully managed. He leaned down slowly enough that she could have stepped back if she wanted to, and she did not want to, and the kiss was brief and certain and tasted like coffee and resolve. When he straightened back up, they looked at each other for a moment. "I have been wanting to do that since September," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew. I can read people, Ralph. I am not helpless." He laughed, which was a thing he did rarely and entirely genuinely when he did it, and the sound of it filled her kitchen like good light. December into January was cold enough to keep them indoors more often than not, and the long evenings by the fire had a quality of intimacy that winter seemed to create naturally, the way it pushed people together by making the outside world inhospitable. They talked more in those weeks than they had talked in all the months before, or rather the talking went deeper, found the rooms in themselves they had been keeping locked. She told him about the early years with Thomas, the hard first winters when they had been so poor they could not afford wood and burned dried cattle dung for heat, the way they had laughed about it then, even though it had not been funny. She told him about Clara's birth on a February night in 1866, just herself and the midwife, and a wind that sounded like it was trying to take the house apart. She told him about the morning she had found Thomas, the way the horse had been standing at the fence as though it was waiting for her, as though it knew she needed to come. He told her about William, about the specific grief of being a father at a distance, the letters he wrote that took weeks to get a reply to, the photographs Catherine sent that showed him a boy growing up in increments he was not present for. He told her about the years after Catherine left when he had put all of himself into the ranch because there was nothing else to put himself into, and the way the ranch had become very good and he had become very much alone, and at some point those two things had stopped feeling like a trade and started feeling like a mistake. "It is not too late," Edna said, because it was not. "No," he agreed. "It is not." January brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days and left the land so white and still that it looked like something from a different world. Ralph was at his own ranch when it hit, and she did not see him for 5 days, which was the longest stretch they had gone without seeing each other since October. On the 6th day, when the roads were passable again, he came by with his wagon loaded with supplies, flour and sugar and coffee and a side of pork, and he looked at her with something that was nakedly relieved in a way he did not try to cover. "I was thinking about you," he said simply. "I was thinking about you too," she said. "Come inside." The town of Caldwell was aware, because small towns are always aware, of what was developing between Edna Keating and Ralph Bishop. On the whole, the town approved. Edna was well-liked in a respect-based way that came from watching her handle widowhood with a kind of unflinching practicality that people found admirable even when they found her a little intimidating. Ralph was respected in the way that quiet, competent men were respected in frontier communities, which is to say people trusted his judgment and appreciated his reliability and did not entirely understand him. There was some amount of gossip, because there was always some amount of gossip, and some of it reached Edna's ears through the reliable channel of the general store, where Mrs. Henderson behind the counter knew everything about everyone and parceled it out in small, strategic amounts. The gossip was, on balance, favorable, though Mrs. Henderson reported that there had been some discussion about the appropriateness of the timeline, Thomas having been gone less than a year. Edna's response to this, delivered to Mrs. Henderson's face with perfect composure, was that she had loved Thomas Keating completely and mourned him genuinely, and would mourn him privately for the rest of her life, and that the length of her mourning was a matter between herself, her God, and her late husband, and that she found it interesting how often people felt qualified to have opinions about a widow's choices when they had not been the one sitting in a cold house alone, with a 7-year-old and a broken fence, and a cattle operation bleeding money. Mrs. Henderson had been delighted by this response, and had repeated it accurately to approximately 14 people by the end of the week. The town largely moved on. Spring came the way spring always came to Kansas, in fits and starts, with a week of warm that raised your hopes, and then a hard frost that dashed them, and then warm again and then cold again, until finally by late March the warmth won and held, and the grass began to come back up green and the creek filled, and the world expanded from the compressed version of itself that winter created. Edna and Ralph rode the fence lines together in April, each on their own side of the property boundary, and it felt easy and right in a way that physical partnership often does when both people involved are competent and comfortable. She had gotten her spectacles by then, a pair of round wire-rimmed ones from the doctor in town, and wearing them had changed the world from a slightly blurry suggestion of itself to something sharp and detailed, and she kept stopping to look at things just because she could see them clearly, and Ralph had noticed this, and had a way of watching her notice things that she found both pleasant and a little embarrassing. "You are staring at that creek like it owes you something," he said on one of their fence-line rides. "I can see every individual rock," she said. "Do you understand how remarkable that is?" He laughed. "I do," he said. "I had spectacles since I was 32, I remember." She had not known this. "You do not wear them." "I wear them when I read. I have learned to manage for most things without them." He paused. "My mother told me I would ruin my eyes squinting, and she was right, which was not a comfortable thing to tell her." She stored this small piece of him in the same place she stored all the other small pieces she had been collecting since July, the accumulating detail of a person you are learning. They were at her kitchen table in early May when the subject came up in a way that was, characteristically for both of them, both practical and without sufficient preamble. He was looking at a piece of paper that showed her cattle records and the projected income for the year, which he had asked to look at because he had a way with numbers that she used when she could, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, without looking up from the paper, "We would do better together." She looked at him. He put the paper down and looked at her. "These two ranches together are more than twice what either of them is separately," he said. "The northeast fence between our properties is redundant. The labor we spend maintaining it could go to other things. The cattle could be managed as one herd more efficiently than two." "That is a business argument," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is also the rest of things. Both of those are true." She was quiet. He waited. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am," he said. "I am also pointing out that it makes good financial sense." "Ralph, yes. I know it makes good financial sense. I can do arithmetic. That is not why I am thinking about it." He was watching her carefully. "I know," he said. "But I did not want to come at this only from the other direction, and have you think I had not considered the practical side of it, because you would have thought less of me for that." She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the borrowed saddle, which was still hanging on her saddle rack, because she had never quite gotten around to returning it. She thought about 7 months of a certain kind of hard and particular loneliness, and about the way Ralph Bishop had appeared in the doorway of her grief like a man who was not trying to fix anything, but was simply willing to stand there with her. She thought about Clara's cedar horse and the water bucket and the blizzard and the spectacles that let her see individual rocks in a creek bed. "Yes," she said. He looked at her as though he wanted to be sure he had heard correctly. "Yes," she said again with more certainty. "I will marry you, Ralph Bishop." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her hands in his and looked down at her with the full, unguarded version of his face that she had only seen a few times, the version he did not show to the world in general. "Good," he said, in the same way he had said it that November evening in her kitchen. "That is very good." "It is," she agreed. He kissed her then, less briefly than the first time, and when he straightened back up his hands were still holding hers, and neither of them felt any particular rush to go anywhere. They were married in June of 1874, 1 year and 11 months after Thomas Keating's death, in the small church on the main street of Caldwell on a day that was warm without being brutal, which felt like the landscape making an effort. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Hadley, who had a tendency to preach at length on most occasions but who understood, possibly because Edna had spoken to him directly beforehand, that brevity was appreciated. Clara wore her best dress, which was blue cotton with white trim, and stood beside her mother throughout the ceremony with a solemn gravity that made several of the assembled guests smile. She had, during the weeks of preparation for the wedding, asked Ralph a series of careful questions about what would change and what would not change, and he had answered each one directly and without condescension, which she had found acceptable. The final question had been whether he would still fix things that were broken, and he had said yes, and she had been satisfied. The guests were modest in number but warm in spirit: the Hendersons from the general store, the doctor and his wife, the Harmon family from the neighboring property to the east, several of the ranching families from the surrounding area who had become genuine friends to both of them over time. There was a small reception afterward at the Caldwell Hotel's dining room, with food that Mrs. Henderson had organized with her characteristic thoroughness, and there was music from a fiddle player named Cole Dressler, who had a way with a slow tune that made the dancing easy even for people who were not naturally dancers. Ralph danced one slow turn around the floor with Clara first, before he danced with Edna, and Clara was entirely serious about it, and held his hand with great formality and put her other hand on his arm, and he bent slightly to accommodate her height and matched his steps to hers, and Edna watched from the side of the room and felt something inside her complete itself in a quiet way that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with this moment. When he came to her afterward and held out his hand for the dance, she looked up at him and said, "That was very well done." "She asked me to practice with her last week," he said, "and I did not mention it because I did not want you to think I was trying to impress you." "You were not trying to impress me. I was also trying to impress you," he admitted. She laughed and took his hand and they danced, and Cole Dressler played something that was sweet and unhurried, and the room felt warm with the specific warmth of people who were genuinely happy for the people in the middle of the floor. The merging of the two properties, which Ralph had described with his characteristic directness as something that would happen gradually and sensibly, happened over the summer and early fall of 1874, with a great deal of practical work and some negotiation that occasionally became spirited, because they were both people with strong opinions about how things should be done, and those opinions did not always align perfectly. They had their first real argument, the kind that was about something more than cattle prices or political differences, in August, over the question of where to live. Ralph had assumed they would move to his house because it was on the larger piece of ground and because it had more outbuildings. Edna had assumed they would stay in her house because it was Clara's home and because she had spent 2 years making it into something that felt like a place she had built for herself. The argument lasted 2 evenings and 1 long morning ride and covered ground that was not really about the houses at all, but about the fear on both sides of being subsumed into the other person's life, rather than building something genuinely new between them. They resolved it, in the end, by building a new house. Not immediately, not that year, but they agreed on it as the plan, and in the meantime they set up life in Edna's house because it was the one with more room for a child, and Ralph's house became the bunkhouse for his hands. The compromise was the kind that worked because both people actually compromised on something real, and they both knew it, and that knowledge was a good foundation for what came after. The new house took most of 2 years to build, partly because they were building it themselves, and with help from neighboring families when it could be arranged, and partly because Edna had opinions about it that were not negotiable, and Ralph had opinions about it that were also not negotiable, and reconciling those opinions took time and several conversations over the kitchen table with rough drawings on brown paper. What they built was a place that was genuinely theirs, low and wide with a deep porch all the way around, rooms large enough to live in, a kitchen that Edna designed herself with the counter heights she actually needed, and the pantry space she had always wanted, and 2 windows on the west wall so she could watch the evening sky. Ralph built the bookshelves in the main room himself, which she had not asked him to do but which made her feel, when she saw them, a particular warmth that she did not try to explain but simply accepted as part of how it was to love someone who paid attention to what you needed without being asked. Fall of 1874 brought the first good cattle season they had together, the merged herd performing exactly as the arithmetic had suggested it would, and the money coming in better than either of them had seen in a few years. Edna used part of her share to buy a new saddle, finally, a proper one fitted to her, and she hung Ralph's borrowed saddle back on its rack in the barn. She had been meaning to return it since the previous spring and kept not getting around to it. He noticed it was back on the rack one afternoon and looked at it and then looked at her. "I was wondering when that was coming back," he said. "I thought about returning it in September," she said. "Of last year." "Yes." He thought about this. "What stopped you?" "I had not found a good enough reason to come back over here," she said. She let that sit. He turned to look at her with something in his expression that was too complicated to name, something that moved through amusement and gratitude and something deeper and quieter. "So the saddle," he said, "was useful," she said, "in more ways than one, apparently." "Yes," she said, "apparently." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they stood in the barn doorway for a moment looking out at the land, which was gold-brown in October light, and the cattle were moving slowly through the far pasture, and the sky was enormous the way the Kansas sky always was, and none of it looked like something to be survived anymore. It looked like something to be lived in. The winter of 1874 to 1875 was the first winter they spent together as a family, and it had the rhythms that a shared house develops over time, the morning order of who needed what when, and the evening order of who did which chores, and the midday order of where Clara needed to be, and when Ralph needed to be out on the land, and when Edna could get to the 100 small tasks of running a property that waited for her like a long list that never quite finished. Clara had settled into the life of having Ralph in the house with the pragmatic adaptability that children sometimes show, particularly children who have been through difficulty, and have learned that arrangements change, and that change can be survived. She called him Ralph, not father, and he had never suggested she should call him anything else, understanding that Thomas Keating was her father and would remain so, and that there was room in a household for a man who was something other than a replacement. What he was to Clara was a person who was reliable and present and genuinely interested in her, who taught her to whittle her own cedar horses because she had asked him to, and because he saw no reason why a girl should not know how to do something useful with her hands, and who sat with her on the porch on summer evenings and named the stars the way his mother had named them for him, which was something Edna would not have known to tell him meant everything to Clara, until Clara mentioned it to her one morning with the slightly embarrassed sincerity of an 8-year-old admitting to something they care about. The letter from Catherine came in February of 1875, and it was addressed to Ralph, but he read it to Edna that evening because they had an agreement, unspoken but solid, that what affected one of them was shared with the other. The letter was from Ohio, and it was civil in tone, and what it contained was the news that Catherine had remarried, a schoolteacher named Morrison, and that William was doing well and had asked in a recent conversation whether his father would consider a visit. Ralph was quiet for a long time after reading it. Edna did not try to fill the silence. "I have wanted to go back there," he said finally. I have wanted to see him." I did not know if she would be comfortable with it. "It seems like she is telling you she would be," Edna said. "Yes," he folded the letter carefully. "I would like to go in the summer." "Then you should go," she said. "I am not sure how long it would take. The journey alone is 2 weeks each way, and I would want time with him." "We will manage," she said. "We managed before. It is different now. Ralph, go see your son." He looked at her with an expression that she had learned to read as one of the ways he showed gratitude. Not quite the same as the way he smiled or the way he looked when he was pleased about something practical, but something more interior than those and more significant. "I will be back," he said. "I know you will," she said. He went to Ohio in June of 1875, leaving the ranch in Edna's capable hands, which capability he trusted completely, and had said so in plain language before he left. He was gone for 7 weeks, which was a long time, but not as long as she had half expected the pull of seeing his son might make it. He came back on a Thursday afternoon with a tan from the Ohio summer that was slightly different from his Kansas tan, and a quality about him that she could only describe as less frayed, as though something that had been rubbing inside him for years had been smoothed out. He brought Clara a book about horses, a real illustrated one with lithograph pictures, which Clara received with the reverent silence of a child confronting something genuinely wonderful. He brought Edna a small package wrapped in brown paper that contained a set of colored threads for embroidery, which she had mentioned exactly once in passing, months ago, that she used to enjoy before the pressures of widowhood had left no time for things that were simply pleasant. "You remembered that," she said, holding the threads. "I remember most things you tell me," he said. She looked up at him. "How was William?" Ralph sat down at the kitchen table, and she could see the 7 weeks in him, the complicated experience of it. "He is a good boy," he said. "He looks like Catherine around the eyes and like me in the way he holds himself, which is a strange thing to see. He is quiet, but he is sharp. He was nervous with me for the first few days, and then he was not, and by the end of the visit we were comfortable. Did he ask about the ranch? He asked about everything. He is curious the way you are curious. He wanted to know how everything works." A pause. "He might come out for a visit." Catherine was not opposed. "I asked William what he thought, and he said he wanted to see a real cattle drive." "Then we will have to arrange for him to see one," Edna said. Ralph looked at her for a moment. "You would be all right with that?" "Ralph, he is your son. There is no world in which I would not be all right with that." He reached across the table and took her hand, not dramatically, just put his large, work-hardened hand over hers, and she turned her palm up and held his. And outside the kitchen window the Kansas summer was doing what it did, burning and bright and relentless. But inside the kitchen there was coffee and colored thread, and the weight of a man's hand in hers, and it was enough. More than enough. By the fall of 1875, Edna knew she was expecting their first child together. She had been quiet about it for 6 weeks, not from any desire to keep secrets but from the careful habit of a woman who had known friends who had been too quick to share news that later became grief. But by October, it was no longer something she could keep to herself, and she did not particularly want to. So she told Ralph on an evening in mid-October, sitting on the new porch they had built on the house they were still in the process of making entirely their own. He was quiet for a moment after she told him, the way he was quiet when something mattered too much for immediate words. Then he turned to look at her, and his face was doing the unguarded thing again, the full version of it. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he asked, and the fact that it was the first thing told her something she already knew about him but valued knowing again. "I am well," she said. "I am tired and occasionally unreasonable about smells, but I am well. The unreasonable part is unlikely to be noticeable," he said, "given normal baselines." That was almost a joke. "It was almost a joke," he agreed. His hand was still in hers and he tightened it slightly. "Edna, I am very glad." "So am I," she said. "I did not expect to be as glad as I am, but here we are." "Here we are," he said. Clara's reaction to the news was characteristically pragmatic. She listened, asked several pointed questions about logistics that demonstrated she had been paying close attention to how households worked, and then said she hoped it was a boy because she already knew how to do all the things that mattered and it would be more interesting to teach them to someone who did not look like her. That is a very particular kind of logic, Ralph told her. It is good logic, Clara said, with the confidence of someone who was absolutely certain of this. The baby was born in May of 1876, a boy, which Clara received as vindication of both her preferences and her logic. He came into the world on a clear spring morning with considerably more noise than Clara had apparently made at her own birth, according to Edna, and he was healthy and substantial, and had, from the very beginning, a disposition that seemed designed to fill every room he occupied. They named him Thomas Ralph Bishop, Thomas for his grandfather by way of the man who had first made Edna a mother, Ralph for the man who was there on the morning he was born, his large hand steady, and his face soft in a way that Edna had never seen it be quite like this before. Ralph Bishop holding his newborn son was the kind of moment that settled something permanently in a person. She watched him and thought about the lonely years after Catherine and the ranch built to excellence, and the man who had been so present in his fields and so absent in his house. She thought about how far he had traveled from that place, and she was grateful in a way that was not simple or small. "Thomas Ralph," Ralph said, looking at the baby in his arms. "Tom," said Clara from the doorway because she had already decided this and no one had consulted her. "Tom," Ralph agreed. Tom Bishop was an easier baby than Clara had apparently been, which was either a matter of temperament or the fact that Edna was older and more settled, and no longer managed her household on the edge of survival, and he grew into a child who was loud and curious and physically fearless in ways that regularly alarmed his parents and delighted his sister. Clara took her role as older sibling with absolute seriousness, which meant she was both instructive and occasionally overbearing, and Tom regarded her with the combination of admiration and frustration that younger siblings have always reserved for the older ones who love them too much. William came out from Ohio in the summer of 1876, when Tom was 2 months old. He was 13 and tall for his age, and he arrived on the stage from Wichita looking travel-worn and slightly apprehensive, and very much like Ralph in the way he held himself, exactly as Ralph had said. Ralph met him at the stage and they rode back to the ranch in the wagon, and Edna watched them come up the lane together and thought about the strange, complicated paths that brought people to the places they ended up. William's visit lasted 6 weeks and was, by every measure, a success. He was reserved at first, in the way of a boy who has learned to be careful in new situations. But Ralph had the patience for careful and the instinct for giving people space to find their own way. And by the end of the first week, William was a different person in the house than he had been on the first day, more settled, more present, beginning to let the newness wear off so the real character underneath could show. He and Clara regarded each other with the particular wariness of two intelligent children of similar age, who are not sure, yet, whether they will be allies or competitors. They were, in the end, allies, in the way that children often become when placed in a situation that requires cooperation, and they discover the other person is actually interesting. By the 3rd week, they had a functioning partnership based primarily on their shared interest in the ranch operations and their shared willingness to work. And Ralph observed this from a thoughtful distance, and said to Edna one evening that it was better than he had hoped. "Children usually are," she said, "if you give them the chance to figure themselves out. Is that what you did with Clara?" "I tried. Mostly I just did not stand in her way." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask him if he would consider spending more time out here," he said. "Not permanently, I would not ask that of Catherine, but summers perhaps, if he wanted to." "Ask him," Edna said. William, when asked, went very quiet in the way of a boy dealing with something that matters too much for a fast answer. He said he would think about it. 2 days before he was scheduled to leave, he told Ralph that he would like to come back the following summer and maybe the one after, if that was still the offer. Ralph said it was always the offer. The years between 1876 and 1878 had a quality of deepening that was different from the years that came before. Not less interesting, but more layered. The way a piece of ground builds up over time, so that what's on the surface is supported by the density of everything below it. Edna and Ralph built their full life the way they built the house, deliberately and in collaboration, and with occasional vigorous disagreement that never cracked the foundation, because the foundation was made of something that held. Their operation grew. They added 20 head of cattle in 1876, another 30 in 1877. They brought in a second ranch hand when it became clear that they needed the help, a young man named Garrett Hale who was 23, and had come west from Missouri with the ambition of most young men from Missouri who came west in those years, and the practical skills to back it up. He was good with cattle and good with horses, and he respected the fact that Edna was as much a rancher as Ralph, and gave her the same direct attention he gave Ralph when either of them gave an instruction, which was not as universal a quality in men of that era as it should have been. Edna was pregnant again in the spring of 1877 and delivered in November, a girl this time, who arrived at 4 in the morning with considerably more drama than Tom had and who seemed, from the very first hours of her life, to regard the world as a place she had opinions about. They named her Me, short for nothing, simply Me, because the name suited her and because Edna had always liked it and there was no reason not to. Clara was 11 when Me was born and had developed by that point into exactly the person Edna had always suspected she would be, capable and opinionated and deeply responsible in ways that sometimes outran her age. She greeted her new sister with the same solemn formality she had greeted most major events in her young life, then held her for a careful 20 minutes and informed Edna that Me would be fine as long as everyone listened to her. "Listen to me," Edna said. "Listen to me," Clara said. Ralph, who had witnessed this exchange from the doorway, retreated to the kitchen to find something extremely important to do there. By 1878, the life they had built was solid enough to bear the weight of everything they put on it, which was considerable. Tom was 2, Me was a few months old, Clara was 12 and already helping with the ranch accounts in a way that showed the same facility with numbers her father had, and had apparently passed on to her. William came every summer and spent enough time at the Bishop Ranch, by that second or third visit that it had become genuinely familiar to him, a second home he navigated with the ease of a person who knows where things are kept. Ralph and William had built something between them that was careful and true and deeply important to both of them, not the same as a father and son who had been together all along, but something that had been made from what was available, and was not lesser for having been made under those conditions. Edna wrote to Catherine once, which was an unusual thing to do, and she had thought carefully about whether to do it before she did. She wrote that William was a good person and a genuine pleasure to have in the house, that she wanted Catherine to know he was well considered and valued, and that she understood the distance and difficulty of the arrangement and was grateful for Catherine's willingness to allow it. She did not expect an extended correspondence from it. What she received was a single letter back that was brief and civil and contained the sentence, "He speaks of you with respect," which was enough to tell her that the situation was, on balance, as good as a situation that was by nature imperfect could be. The fall of 1878 brought the first real hardship since the bad years after Thomas. A disease moved through the cattle herds in the region, and while the Bishop operation was not hit as hard as some because Ralph had moved quickly at the first signs and separated the healthy animals from anything that showed symptoms, they lost 14 head over 6 weeks, which was significant. The winter that followed was tight, not desperate but close to uncomfortable, and Edna found herself returning to the frugal economies she had learned in the hard years, stretching the pantry and watching the books with the careful attention of a woman who knew that hardship came and went, but that being unprepared for it was the thing you could not afford. Ralph did not handle financial stress with silence, which she had been slightly worried about before she knew him well enough to know better. He handled it by working harder and thinking clearly, and talking to her about it with the same directness he brought to everything, which meant they were solving a problem together rather than one person carrying it, and the other not knowing how heavy it was. They came through the winter without serious damage, and by spring the herd was recovering and the books were balancing, and the tight feeling in the household loosened back into the comfortable solidity it had before. "We are all right," Ralph told her in April, looking at the spring cattle count. "We are," she agreed. "We lost some ground but not the important parts." "The important parts are all right," she said. "The rest we can rebuild." He looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention that had not diminished in the years since he had first applied it to her across a barn floor. "You know," he said, "I think I liked you immediately that first day. I'm not sure I admitted it to myself, but I think I did. The first day I came to borrow the saddle." "Yes." "You did not show it." "I was careful," he said. "I had been careless before and I had learned from it." "You were very careful," she agreed, "for months. And then I stopped being careful." "Yes," she said. "You did." He reached over and touched her face in the way he had of doing it sometimes, his thumb at her jawline, brief and certain. "Good decision," he said. "The best one I ever made," she said, and meant it completely. The spring of 1879 brought the completion of the new house, which had been long in progress due to the demands of everything else a working ranch required. And the moving into it was a day that Edna had looked forward to for so long it felt slightly unreal when it actually happened. They moved their things in late April, and the children helped in the way children helped, which was enthusiastically and not always in the most efficient direction. And by the end of the day, they were all sitting in the main room surrounded by the incomplete arrangement of everything they owned, Tom on Ralph's knee looking at the bookshelves, Clara directing Mies crawling away from a pile of boxes, and Edna standing in the kitchen doorway looking at the two windows on the west wall that she had insisted on and watching the afternoon light come through them at exactly the angle she had imagined it would. Ralph came to stand beside her. "Is it what you wanted?" he said. "It is exactly what I wanted," she said. "Then it was worth the 2 years," he said. "It was worth more than 2 years," she said. That evening, after the children were in their beds and the house was quiet around them in the particular way that new houses are quiet, full of the sound of itself settling into its own foundations, Ralph and Edna sat on the porch that went all the way around and looked out at the land that was entirely theirs now in every way that mattered. The sky was doing the Kansas thing it did in late spring evenings, going through every color it owned from west to east, and the cattle were quiet in the far pasture, and somewhere in the distance a nighthawk was calling. "5 years ago," Edna said, "if you had told me this was where I would be, I would not have believed it." "5 years ago I would not have believed it either," he said. "What would you have said if someone had told you that a widow was going to walk into your barn one morning and borrow a saddle, and that in 5 years you would be sitting on a new porch together with 3 children in the house behind you?" He thought about this in the unhurrying way he thought about things. "I would have said that sounded like something that happened to other people," he said. And now it is the thing that happened to me," he said. "And I cannot imagine any of the other things that might have happened instead." She leaned against him the way she did, her shoulder against his upper arm, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the cooling evening and watched the stars come out over Kansas, the same stars Ralph had taught Clara to name the way his mother had named them for him, the same sky that had been over the land when it was wild and unbroken, and would be over it long after all of them were gone, and none of that particular vastness made the moment feel small. If anything, it made it feel exactly the right size, the size of 2 people who had found each other across a borrowed saddle and a fence line and a long Kansas year, and who had built something out of all the pieces of their imperfect and complicated lives that was, in the end, solid and warm and entirely worth everything it had cost. "Ralph," she said. "Yes, I am glad I needed to borrow a saddle." He was quiet for a moment, and then the low sound of his laugh came and she felt it against her shoulder where she leaned on him. "So am I," he said. "God, so am I." They stayed on the porch until the night was fully down and the stars were bright enough to navigate by. And then they went inside to their new house and their children, and the accumulated weight of all the ordinary, extraordinary things they had built together. And the porch held the empty chairs for a while before the wind moved through and the night settled fully in, and the house stood solid against the dark Kansas sky. And inside it, something that had started with a borrowed saddle had become a life that would last. The summer of 1879, William came for what turned out to be the longest visit yet, 8 weeks, and he spent most of it working alongside Ralph in a way that had moved well past the awkward getting-to-know-each-other phase of the early visits into something that looked, to anyone watching, like a father and son who simply knew each other well and worked well together and found each other's company easy. William was 16 by then and had the thoughtful, careful quality of his father and the directness of his mother, and was becoming, by all available evidence, a person of genuine character. On his last evening before heading back to Ohio, he sat on the new porch with Edna after Ralph had gone to check the horses, and he was quiet for a while in the way he went quiet when he was working up to something. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, which was what he called her, not Edna, not anything else, and she had never corrected it because it was what felt right to him. "I wanted to say something before I left." "All right," she said. "He is different," William said. "My father. Different from what I remember when I was small, before everything. He was always good, but he was somewhere else, most of the time somewhere else. He is not like that now." She waited because he was not finished. "I know that is because of you," he said, "and I wanted you to know that I see it." She looked at this 16-year-old boy who had his father's jaw and his father's careful attention and something entirely his own in the set of his shoulders, and she felt a warmth for him that had nothing complicated in it. "He has worked very hard to be here," she said. "That is his doing, not mine." "Maybe," William said, "but I think you gave him something to be here for." She was quiet for a moment. "He gave me the same thing," she said. "It works both ways." William nodded, satisfied with this in the way of someone who was not looking for a complicated answer, but only for an honest one. "I am glad he has you," he said, "and your family. You are part of this family too," she said, "when you want to be." He looked at her and his face did the thing she had seen his father's face do, the unguarded moment when something meant more than you intended to show. "I know," he said. "I'm glad about that too." Ralph came back from the horses and found them on the porch and looked between them with the instinct of a man who could read a situation and understood that something had been completed here, and he sat down in the third chair, and the three of them watched the summer evening come down over the land without any of them feeling the need to say much more. When William left the next morning, Ralph stood at the gate and watched the wagon carrying him toward town for a long time, and then he turned and walked back to the house where Edna was standing in the kitchen doorway, and Tom was running across the yard toward him at the full speed that Tom ran at most things, and Mee was watching from the window with the serious expression she had apparently been born wearing. He caught Tom and swung him up, and Tom shrieked with pure joy, and Ralph carried him toward the porch, and Edna stepped back to let them through into the kitchen, and her hand touched Ralph's arm as he passed her, just briefly, just to say what hands said when words were not the thing needed. He looked at her over Tom's dark head, and his face was full and settled and entirely present, and she understood that this was what the years had been building toward. This ordinary morning in their kitchen, with the children around them and the land outside the windows, and all the accumulated ordinary weight of a life that had been made with intention and care. Edna Bishop, who had come to a barn to borrow a saddle and had walked out with considerably more than she had bargained for, thought that there was no better measure of a good life than finding that you had more than you had known to want. She put the coffee on and called to Clara to come and eat her breakfast and handed Ralph a cup when he finally put Tom down. And outside the kitchen windows, the Kansas morning was doing what it always did, unfolding broad and clear and full of possibility. And inside the house that they had built together, the day was beginning the same way it always began, with the ordinary sounds of a family that was entirely and permanently, and with great gratitude itself. The borrowed saddle stayed on the rack in the barn for the rest of their lives together. She never returned it. She kept it because it reminded her that the most important things sometimes arrive disguised as practical necessities, and because Ralph, when she finally told him about this particular private reason, had looked at her for a moment and then said, with complete seriousness, that he had always intended she should keep it. "You never said so," she pointed out. "I figured you would get there on your own," he said. She had gotten there. She always got there in the end. And so had he, and the distance between where they had started and where they had arrived was exactly the right distance to have traveled together.